I'm a janitor for an office building. It's not my first choice of a job, but I've always been a night owl and the pay is decent. I actually like being alone for the most part, as I tend to have a lot of anxiety, and this job gives me a chance to make some money without having to deal with all the social factors that go into other jobs I've had. My hours are usually 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., though that can shift depending on the day of the week and the needs of the office. There's one other janitor that works on the days that I don't. The building is a mid-sized corporate office building with 4 floors, a basement level, a lobby level, and 2 floors of office spaces. I'm usually able to take my time cleaning the building because it's not the largest place, and the basement is essentially just for storage, leaving only the 3 upper floors for routine maintenance. There is no overnight security, and the doors are locked when the last employee leaves, usually between 6 and 7. I should mention that there is a rear entrance to the building as well that is used for trash and recycling, as well as delivery shipments. This happened to me recently. I was working my shift, it was about 2 in the morning, and I was vacuuming the 2nd floor of the building. I listen to a lot of podcasts and music when I work, and most of the time I have my earbuds in. I was about halfway through vacuuming the cubicles when out of the corner of my eye, in the direction I'd come from, I could have sworn that I saw movement near the stairwell door. It was very brief, like a shadow passing across a wall. I turned off the vacuum and took out my earbuds, calling out to see if anyone was there. I don't know what I was expecting, but of course, nobody replied. The silence felt very pronounced though, as it is whenever something loud that's been on for a while is suddenly turned off. I decided to go look to make sure, and walked over toward the stairwell, looking down the hall toward the bathrooms, but I didn't see anything. I walked to the men's room, opened the door, checked under the stalls, and called out, "Hello?" But there was nothing. I did the same to the women's room, but there was also nothing. So I walked back to the vacuum and was about to put my earbuds back in when from beyond the closed door of the stairwell I heard a thunk, like the sound of a door on one of the lower floors closing. I went to the stairwell and opened the door, calling down again, but I heard nothing. I went down the stairs thinking that maybe by some chance the other janitor had let himself in to pick something up that he had left here the night before, but it didn't make any sense why he wouldn't notify me of his presence. When I got to the ground floor, I opened the door and entered the lobby. I walked to the front door and checked to see if it was locked, which it was. I waited for a few minutes, just listening, but I didn't hear anything. I didn't really know what to think. Sometimes buildings make sounds that you just can't account for, and I didn't really have any other explanation, so I assumed I was just working myself up and walked back to the stairwell. I was about to climb back up to the 2nd floor when I heard a muffled noise from below where the basement door is. I walked down the stairs and waited outside the basement door, listening, but there was nothing, so I opened the basement door. The lights were off except for an overhead exit sign, and the only sound was the boiler or furnace running. I stepped in and started to feel around for the light switch, which I had only turned on maybe like one other time in the year that I had worked here. But as my hand was swiping around on the wall for the switch, it suddenly bumped across what was very distinctly a person's arm. It was like my fingertips very quickly ran from the shoulder of a t-shirt down along the bare skin and hair of an arm. I immediately turned around and ran up the stairs, slamming the door of the stairwell behind me and running out through the front door across the street where I called the police. They arrived about 5 minutes later and checked the entire building, but didn't find anybody. They did, however, find a bunch of food trash and some blankets in the basement, as well as layers of clothing. The assumption was that this person had somehow gotten in through the rear entrance of the building and had been hiding down there for some time. Most likely, it was just a harmless homeless person who was looking for some shelter, but it obviously shook me up for a while. I worked nights for a motel that's sort of on the outskirts of town. I've been here for about 3 years now. The town is pretty small, and sometimes the guests we get can be sketchy, if I'm being honest, but it pays the bills. We don't usually get a lot of requests during the night, and usually the ones we do are pretty basic, like noise complaints or problems with room temperatures, things like that. If I need to, I'll either call or physically go to a room in order to ask for the guests to quiet down or make sure their thermostat and AC are working correctly, but that's rare. It was a weeknight, so it wasn't the busiest we've ever been, and there had been no issues so far. I was reading my book when the front desk phone rang. I answered it, but the line immediately went dead. Sometimes people knock the phone off the hook in their rooms and bump into or roll on the buttons, and it calls the front desk by accident. So I assumed something like that had happened. I forgot about it and went back to reading my book. About 3 minutes later, the phone rang again. When I answered it this time, the line stayed active, but nobody would respond to me, so once again, I hung up. I hadn't really encountered anybody pranking the motel before, but I figured it was within the realm of possibility. Our phone systems show us which room it's from when a person calls the front desk, so I could see that whoever had called was calling from room 43, which is on the second story and facing away from the front desk and into a wooded area that extends to the highway a couple 100 yards away. I decided that I would give it one more chance, and if the calls continued, I would go up to the room to find out what the problem was. I didn't even go back to reading. I just sat there, waiting for the phone to ring, and after about a minute, it did. I picked it up, and there was silence once again. So I stood up and was about to hang the phone up when through the receiver, a woman in this extremely quiet voice said, "There's someone in my room," and then the line went dead. I was super confused. It sounded almost like she was whispering and whimpering at the same time, and the statement just didn't make any sense. I stood there holding the phone. I hadn't even had time to respond after she spoke before she hung up, and I was so taken by surprise that I was literally standing there with the phone in my hand for probably 30 seconds just thinking about what had happened before it occurred to me to hang back up. I sat back down, woke up the computer, and opened the guest management program. I scrolled through the guests to see who was staying in room 43, but what was even more confusing was that there was nobody booked in that room. So I got up, put on my jacket, walked out of the lobby and around the back of the building. There were a handful of cars in the parking lot back there, but everything was quiet and none of them were idling. I got to the staircase leading up to the second floor and went up. I was able to get to the room pretty quickly. It's one of those motels where the doors are basically facing outside, so once you walk out of a room, you're standing on a walkway that is either on or above the parking lot. I walked up to the door and looked through the window, but the curtains were closed, which is the default for our rooms. I knocked on the door and waited. Nobody answered or came. I knocked again and announced myself and said that I would be entering the room. Again, nobody replied or came to the door. I took out the master key card and swiped it. The door handle beeped, turned green, and I heard the lock slide back. I pressed the handle down and opened the door just enough to call directly into the room. It was dark inside, but I could see that there was a dim light coming from somewhere deeper in. I called into the room, once again announcing myself and asking if anyone was inside. No answer. I pushed the door the rest of the way open. Even in the dark, I could see that the room looked completely normal. The bed was made and nothing appeared out of place, but the bathroom door was cracked and the light in there was on. I called out one more time as loudly and clearly as I could, and still no one replied. I flipped up the light switch next to the door and nothing happened, which to this day is one of the most chilling things I have ever experienced. There was absolutely zero reason this would happen unless every bulb connected to the circuit had burnt out, which was impossible. I started walking as quietly as I could toward the bathroom, leaning to check behind the bed as I walked by. They're the kind of motel beds that connect to the floor, so I knew nobody could be underneath. I walked past the closet, which was empty, and when I got to the bathroom, I rested my hand on the door before pushing it the rest of the way open. When I did, I could see that the bathroom was filled with steam, and the mirror was fogged up, like somebody had been taking a shower. But there was no water in the tub, and neither the shower or the bath were dripping, which all of our tubs do for a while after the water is shut off. I was confused and turned to walk back into the main room when I noticed that the light switch in the bathroom was in the off position. Right then, the main door to the room, which I had left propped open on the latch bolt, slammed shut, and at the same time, the lights in the bathroom turned off while the lights in the main room turned on. I ran out of the room, turning off the light on the way out of there, looking both ways down the walkway, but saw and heard no one. I went back to the front desk and checked the security cameras and also saw no one entering or leaving the room except for me. I tried explaining this to the owner of the motel, but just felt like an idiot and could tell she was humoring me. I have not and will never go back in that room and was finally able to switch to daytime shifts. I will never work nights again anywhere. When I had just graduated college, I had gotten into a car accident and basically totaled my car. I ended up moving back home for a while and needed to find a job to save some money. Where we lived, you basically need a car to go anywhere or do anything. I ended up taking a job at a gas station that was about a 30-minute walk from where my parents lived at the time. It was kind of a weird location. It was near the highway, but a bit isolated and surrounded by woods. The type of place you would only stop off at and fill up on a drive to somewhere else. I knew this wasn't going to be a long-term thing, but I needed money, and the location meant I didn't need a car to get back and forth to work. Because I was new, I got scheduled for the worst shifts, which were basically all overnight. But it was the best I could do at the time, and I couldn't be picky. It took a few days to get used to the hours, but once you do, it really isn't that bad. One night, sometime in the very early morning, a car pulled into the lot of the gas station, but not up to the pumps. Eventually, this middle-aged guy who looked pretty rough got out and came into the store. Our gas station would keep a warmer with fried food in it throughout the night, and I remember I was making a batch of French fries when he came in. He went up and down the aisles like he was browsing at a grocery store, but not picking up anything. I felt kind of uncomfortable whenever people came in because it was usually just me and them at that hour, so I typically tried to break the ice and make conversation with people to make it less awkward. I asked him if he needed any help finding anything, and he said no and asked me how long I had worked there without looking at me. There was definitely something off about this guy. He seemed really frazzled, like something else was on his mind, but at the same time, the tone of his question was very direct and serious, not casual conversation like was my intention. I told him I had just started recently, and he looked up at me. There was this weird pause, and then he asked me if there was anyone else working with me tonight. I started to get very uncomfortable and lied that there was a manager in the back office who was working on some accounting stuff. He just looked at me for this really long, awkward beat and then walked out of the store. He went toward his vehicle where we had an old payphone that I had never seen anyone use. This was back when cell phones were barely a thing. My perspective was from behind the phone booth. I could see that he had picked up the phone and called someone and was talking to them. And the entire time he kept glancing over at me like he was talking about me but didn't want me to know. When he finished, he got back in his car and just sat there. I could not see through the car windows, so I didn't know what he was doing in there. The whole situation was weird, but at the same time, nothing had actually happened. So I tried to shrug it off, assuming this guy was just a bit eccentric and taking a break from driving to rest or something. The vehicle stayed there for like an hour, but every so often the man would get out and make another phone call, during which he would keep looking through the window at me. It was extremely strange and unsettling. Eventually, I decided that it was probably best to ask him if he needed help or if I could call him a tow truck or something. I didn't really think he would need one, but I figured it would let him know that I was keeping track of his presence and maybe put a bit of pressure on him to move along. So I did a quick mop of the floor and went outside. I walked up to the car and waved through the windshield even though I couldn't see into it. He was parked in an area of the lot where there wasn't much light from the lamps. I then walked up to the driver's side of the vehicle, expecting him to open it or roll down the window, but he didn't. I thought maybe he had fallen asleep, so I leaned in and peered through the window, but what I saw confused me. There was nobody inside. I did the same to the back windows and didn't see anybody there either. I stood up and looked around, but didn't see him anywhere. There had been a couple cars that came into the station and left during the time that he had been there, but nobody else was there now, and he was nowhere in sight. It was just me in the lot and his car and the woods. I then looked over at the payphone, and this was maybe the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. I could see that the actual cord wasn't even connected to the phone. It had been cut, but not recently. It looked rusted and broken, like the phone hadn't been able to make a call in years. This meant that every time he had gotten out of his car to make a phone call, he hadn't been talking to anyone. I ran back inside and locked the door. I checked the back room and the back door to make sure that was locked as well, and then called the police. It wasn't like an emergency call or something, but it was such a weird situation, and I was still new enough that I just wanted someone to come out and take a look around. They came, but the man literally never came back. They found that the car was stolen from a few towns over. I described the man to them, but there was likely no way to identify him based off of that. And the security cameras back then were so bad that even seeing him in the recording wasn't very helpful. I have no idea what he wanted or what was going through that guy's mind, but I'll always remember his weird interaction with me and the way he was looking at me while he was pretending to make those phone calls.